I never expected a simple drive through the Nevada desert to become the most terrifying experience of my life. But that's exactly what happened when I stumbled upon something the government clearly didn't want me to see: a hidden military base that shouldn't exist. Welcome to Eerie Road Tales, where the stories are real and the horrors are undeniable. I'm here to share the chilling events of that day, the discoveries I made, and the escape that still haunts me to this very moment. By the end of this story, you'll understand why I abandoned my search for the unknown and why some secrets are better left buried. The Nevada desert is a place of extremes, a barren, sun-scorched expanse stretching endlessly in every direction. It's known for its stark beauty and isolation, but for decades, it has also been the epicenter of mystery. This isn't just any desert. It's home to some of the most secretive government installations in the world. Area 51, for example, has been the subject of conspiracy theories and public fascination since the mid-20th century. Even those who dismiss UFO sightings can't deny the base's connection to classified military operations. This story, however, doesn't take place near Area 51 or the Nevada test site. It unfolds in a seemingly empty patch of desert northeast of Las Vegas, an area with no official record of ownership, no documented purpose, and no reason for anyone to be there. That was exactly what made it so intriguing to me. It was the early 1990s. I had always been drawn to exploring the unexplained, old ghost towns, abandoned structures, places where the world's secrets felt just out of reach. Back then, the internet was in its infancy, and information wasn't as readily available as it is today. You had to rely on whispers, word of mouth, and local legends to find your way to something extraordinary. I had been tipped off about this location by a man named Charlie, a grizzled local who knew the desert better than anyone I'd ever met. I had run into him at a small roadside diner outside of Vegas, where we got to talking about the strange things people claim to see out in the desert. He told me about a patch of land up north, a place he insisted I should avoid. "I'm serious, kid," he said, lighting a cigarette with hands weathered by the sun. "There are places out there where you're not supposed to go. The kind of places where folks disappear and no one asks questions." Charlie's warning only fueled my curiosity. He mentioned seeing unmarked vehicles driving in and out of the area and hearing strange sounds echoing through the desert at night. He didn't offer much more detail, but his tone was enough to convince me there was something worth investigating. The Nevada desert, even beyond Area 51, is steeped in a history of secrecy. The government has used vast stretches of it for everything from nuclear testing to classified military experiments. In the 1950s and 60s, entire towns were built and destroyed during nuclear tests, with mannequins placed in homes to study the effects of radiation. And those were just the experiments the public eventually found out about. This particular area, however, was different. Unlike the test sites or other known military zones, it wasn't marked on any map. I checked everything I could get my hands on: public land records, old survey maps, even satellite images, and there was nothing. Not even a hint that the government had purchased or used the land. The lack of information made it all the more suspicious. Even top-secret facilities like Area 51 are visible on satellite imagery, albeit with limited detail. But this place? It was as if it didn't exist. That kind of intentional erasure raised more questions than it answered. At the time, the Cold War had only recently ended, but secrecy around military projects was still rampant. Experimental aircraft like the State Route 71 Blackbird and the F-117 Nighthawk had been developed in absolute secrecy during the previous decades, with their existence only revealed years after their creation. It wasn't a stretch to think the government might have other hidden projects buried in the desert, especially during that era of heightened security and technological advancement. I couldn't get the idea out of my head. If there really was something out there, a base, a project, or something even stranger, it could be one of the most significant discoveries of my life. I had no idea at the time just how close I would come to learning the truth, or how much I'd regret pursuing it. This was the backdrop against which I found myself driving out into the desert, armed with nothing more than a map, a flashlight, and an insatiable need to know. I told myself it was just another adventure, another story for my journal. But deep down, I knew this felt different. There was an unease that settled over me before I even left the city, a sense that I was heading toward something I wasn't prepared to face. It wasn't long before I realized Charlie's warning wasn't just desert lore. He knew something, even if he wasn't willing to say it outright. And by the time I reached that desolate patch of land, I would wish I had listened. It was late morning when I left the paved road behind, my tires crunching over the dry, rocky ground of the Nevada desert. The heat was relentless, the kind that makes the air shimmer just above the horizon. I had my map spread across the passenger seat, though I knew it wouldn't be much help. According to every map I'd checked, I was driving into a stretch of land that was supposed to be completely empty, just dirt and sand for miles. I wasn't entirely sure what I was looking for. Charlie's warning played over in my mind, but instead of deterring me, it pushed me forward. I told myself it was just a story, a local legend meant to scare off curious wanderers. Still, there was an edge of uncertainty in my gut that I couldn't quite shake. 4 hours, I navigated the rugged terrain, my truck jostling over uneven ground. The sun blazed overhead, casting long, stark shadows that stretched across the landscape. I had to stop occasionally to clear the dust off my windshield, the fine grit clinging to everything. Out there, with nothing but the hum of the engine and the occasional caw of a distant bird, the desert felt endless, a vast, indifferent expanse. And then I saw it. At first, it was just a smudge on the horizon, a shape that didn't belong. As I got closer, the smudge became clearer, an outline of something tall, angular, and man-made. I slowed the truck, squinting against the sunlight. There it was, standing defiantly against the barren backdrop, a structure. It wasn't much, just a cluster of low buildings and what looked like a tall antenna or tower of some sort. But it didn't make sense. This place wasn't on any map. There were no signs, no fences, nothing to indicate this area was anything other than open desert. Yet here it was, an unmistakable silhouette against the emptiness. I parked a good distance away and stepped out of the truck. The air was still and heavy, the kind of silence that presses on your ears. As I approached on foot, the crunch of my boots on the gravel seemed deafening. The closer I got, the more I noticed details that didn't sit right. There were tire tracks in the dirt, fresh ones. They crisscrossed the area in wide arcs, as though someone had been moving heavy equipment back and forth. I paused, crouching to run my fingers over one of the grooves. It wasn't more than a day or two old. That's when I heard it. A faint hum. I straightened up, my eyes scanning the area. The sound was so low it was almost imperceptible, but it was there, a steady vibration in the air, like machinery running somewhere nearby. My heart started to pick up pace. As I moved closer to the buildings, I spotted something else, a small, black camera mounted on a pole. It was partially concealed behind a rock, its lens fixed on the path I was walking. My stomach churned. Someone was watching this place, no question about it. I pressed on, drawn by a mix of fear and curiosity. The hum grew louder, though I still couldn't pinpoint its source. The buildings themselves were nondescript, flat-roof structures made of concrete, with no windows and no visible markings. Then I noticed something that made my skin crawl. A patch of ground near one of the buildings had been recently disturbed. The dirt was darker, looser, like it had been dug up and filled back in. Next to it, there were faint impressions of boot prints, too large and uniform to be random. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The back of my neck prickled, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often than I'd like to admit. The silence felt heavier now, broken only by the occasional gust of wind. The closer I got to the largest building, the more I noticed signs that something was off. A faint smell hung in the air, chemical, sharp, and metallic. It reminded me of old machinery or something industrial, though there were no visible signs of equipment outside. I stopped a few feet from the entrance, my hand hovering near the old, rusted door handle. The hum was louder here, vibrating through the soles of my boots. My instinct screamed at me to turn back, to leave whatever this was alone. But I couldn't. I had to know. I reached out, gripping the handle. It was warm under my hand, the heat from the sun radiating through the metal. Slowly, I pulled the door open, and the sound of creaking hinges echoed into the stillness. What lay inside would only deepen the mystery, and my fear. Are you enjoying this story so far? If you are, make sure to subscribe to Eerie Road Tales for more spine-chilling adventures like this one. As I stood there, hand gripping the rusted door handle, I felt the weight of the decision I was about to make. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to leave this place and forget I ever saw it. But curiosity has a way of overpowering fear, and that unrelenting need to know pushed me forward. Slowly, I stepped inside. The air was different, cooler, but with a metallic bite that clung to my throat. The dim light filtering through cracks in the walls revealed a narrow corridor ahead, its walls made of concrete, scarred and stained by time. My boots echoed softly against the floor as I moved deeper inside, the hum I'd heard earlier now vibrating through the entire space. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, steady and unyielding. About 10 steps in, I stopped. Something caught my eye, a corner of fabric draped against the wall, blending into the shadows. I stepped closer and realized it wasn't fabric at all but camouflage netting, carefully placed to obscure an entrance. My heart skipped. This wasn't just some abandoned building. Someone had gone to great lengths to hide whatever lay beyond. I hesitated, glancing back toward the door I'd just come through. The sunlight outside seemed impossibly far away now, almost like it belonged to another world. With a deep breath, I pulled the netting aside and revealed a metal hatch embedded in the wall. It looked like something out of an old war movie, heavy, industrial, and foreboding. There was no lock, just a large wheel handle in the center. My palms were slick with sweat as I grasped it and turned. The wheel groaned in protest, the sound reverberating down the corridor, and then, with a final heave, the hatch swung open. What greeted me on the other side was like stepping into a different era. The room was vast and dimly lit, the only illumination coming from flickering fluorescent lights overhead. Rows of machinery lined the walls, massive, hulking contraptions that buzzed faintly, their purpose a complete mystery to me. Wires snaked across the floor, and the smell of oil and rust was overpowering. I moved cautiously, my flashlight cutting through the gloom. On a table nearby, I spotted a stack of documents, their edges yellowed with age. I picked one up, my hands trembling slightly. The text was faded, typed in neat lines that were hard to decipher in the poor light. Words like experiment, containment, and anomalous jumped out at me, sending a shiver down my spine. Flipping through the pages, I saw diagrams, some of machines, others of things. Shapes and figures that didn't look natural. My pulse quickened as I realized the scale of what I'd stumbled upon. This wasn't just some forgotten military outpost. It was a place of experimentation, of testing things that shouldn't exist. As I placed the document back down, a noise cut through the silence. A soft, rhythmic clicking, like the ticking of a clock. It was coming from the far end of the room, where a door stood slightly ajar. I moved toward it, every step feeling heavier than the last. Pushing the door open, I found myself in a smaller room, this one filled with glass chambers, each about the size of a phone booth. Most were empty, but a few contained things. I can't even describe them properly. They were humanoid, but not quite. Their proportions were off, their limbs too long, their faces obscured by something, masks or coverings that hid their features. They were motionless, but the sight of them sent a jolt of fear through me. Suddenly, a deafening alarm blared, the sound cutting through the air like a knife. Red lights began to flash, bathing the room in an eerie glow. My chest tightened as I realized the gravity of my situation. I had triggered something, and now the entire facility knew I was here. My first instinct was to run, but I froze, my eyes darting around the room for a way out. The alarm was relentless, the lights disorienting, and my heartbeat pounded in my ears like a drum. I stumbled back into the main chamber, my movements frantic as I searched for an exit. The hum I'd heard earlier was louder now, almost deafening, and I could feel it in my chest, like it was resonating through my entire body. I turned down a corridor, then another, the maze-like layout of the facility making it impossible to tell where I was going. My flashlight flickered, and for a terrifying moment, I was plunged into darkness. I slapped the side of the device, the beam sputtering back to life just in time to illuminate a large metal door at the end of the hallway. I sprinted toward it, the sound of my footsteps swallowed by the blaring alarm. My hands fumbled with the latch, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. When the door finally gave way, I stumbled through, slamming it shut behind me. The sound of the alarm was muffled now, but it didn't matter. I could still feel the weight of the place pressing down on me, the oppressive sense that I had crossed a line I shouldn't have. My hands trembled as I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath, knowing that this was far from over. I don't know how long I stood there, pressed against the cold metal door, my heart hammering in my chest. The alarms were still wailing somewhere deeper in the facility, but the oppressive red lights had been replaced by complete darkness. The silence that followed felt even worse than the noise. It was the kind of quiet that made you feel watched. I knew I couldn't stay. My instincts screamed at me to move, to find a way out before whoever, or whatever, was alerted by that alarm found me first. I forced myself to push off the door and keep going, even though my legs felt weak and my breaths were shallow. My flashlight beam wavered in my trembling hand as I retraced my steps through the facility. The corridors seemed to stretch endlessly, each one identical to the last. Every corner I turned felt like stepping deeper into a trap. The hum that had been faint earlier now felt like it was inside my skull, pulsing with every beat of my heart. Finally, I spotted it, the hatch I had come through, partially hidden by the camouflage netting. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. Just as I reached the ladder leading back to the surface, I heard it, faint, shuffling footsteps. I froze, my ears straining to pinpoint the direction of the sound. It was coming from somewhere behind me, slow and deliberate, echoing faintly against the concrete walls. My chest tightened as I realized whoever, or whatever, it wasn't in a hurry. It knew the facility better than I did, and it had no reason to rush. I climbed the ladder as quietly as I could, every creak of the metal rungs sending a jolt of panic through me. When I reached the top, I shoved the hatch open and scrambled onto the desert floor. The air outside was still and cool, but I didn't stop to savor it. I pulled the hatch shut behind me, my hands fumbling to secure it before covering it again with the netting. I ran. The desert stretched out endlessly before me, bathed in the dim glow of moonlight. My truck was still parked where I had left it, and it felt like a lifeline in the vast emptiness. The crunch of my boots against the dirt sounded deafening in the silence, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something, or someone, emerge from the darkness behind me. When I finally reached the truck, I yanked the door open and threw myself inside, locking it in one swift motion. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I slammed my foot on the gas, the tires kicking up a cloud of dust as I sped away from that cursed place. I drove for hours, my knuckles white as I gripped the steering wheel. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that at any moment something would appear in my rear-view mirror. But the road behind me remained empty, the desert stretching out into nothingness. When I finally made it back to civilization, I parked in a random lot and just sat there, my hands still trembling. The weight of what I'd seen, what I'd experienced, pressed down on me like a heavy blanket. My mind raced with questions, each one more troubling than the last. What was that place? What were those things I saw in the glass chambers? And what had I triggered when I set off that alarm? 4 days, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those corridors, those machines, those creatures. I heard the alarm, the hum, the faint sound of footsteps in the darkness. I started to notice things, too. Black SUVs parked near my house that weren't there before, strangers who seemed to linger a little too long when I was out. I thought about writing it all down, sharing it with the world. But every time I tried, I stopped. What if they came after me? What if I'd already seen too much? The truth is, I don't know what I stumbled upon out there in the desert. I don't know if it was a forgotten Cold War relic, a hidden experiment, or something far beyond human understanding. And I don't know how many other places like it exist, concealed in the shadows, waiting to be discovered by someone like me. But I do know one thing: I'll never go back. That part of my life, the curiosity, the need to uncover hidden truths, it ended that night. Some secrets aren't meant to be uncovered. And sometimes, it's better not to know. As I reflect on what happened that night, I can't help but question how much of the world we live in remains hidden from us. How many undisclosed operations are conducted in places like that, far removed from public view? This wasn't just a forgotten relic or an abandoned facility. The precision of its concealment, the advanced measures taken to obscure its existence, and the unsettling contents within, it all points to a deliberate effort to keep this place from ever being discovered. The lengths taken to maintain secrecy are what haunt me most. Who decides what we're allowed to know and what must be hidden? I understand the need for national security, for protecting advancements and assets from prying eyes. But at what cost? At what point does secrecy become a danger, not just to outsiders but to those within its grasp? This experience opened my eyes to the fragile balance between security and transparency. Facilities like the one I found aren't unique. There have been other discoveries, such as Camp Century, a secret U.S. military base built beneath Greenland's ice during the Cold War. Ostensibly an Arctic research station, it concealed a nuclear-powered infrastructure intended for missile storage and deployment. The project was eventually abandoned, but remnants of it, and its potential consequences, remain buried beneath the ice. And that's just one example we know about. How many more exist, their true purposes lost to time or kept deliberately in the dark? How many secrets lie buried beneath our feet, waiting for someone like me to stumble upon them? It's a sobering thought. Some would argue that secrecy protects us, that the hidden truths of places like this are better left undiscovered. But others might say that ignorance leaves us vulnerable, that we have a right to know what's being done in the shadows. I'm still not sure where I stand. All I know is that what I found out there in the desert will stay with me forever, a reminder of just how much of the world remains unseen. So, what do you think lies hidden in the world's most remote and desolate places? Could there be more facilities like the one I encountered, or something even stranger? Share your thoughts, and if you've had similar experiences, let us know in the comments below. And if this story left you curious, or maybe even unsettled, don't forget to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to Eerie Road Tales for more journeys into the unknown. Always remember, the world is vast and full of secrets. But some discoveries come with a price I know all too well.